What happens when silence becomes your greatest weapon? When the world mistakes your stillness for weakness, never realizing that beneath the surface lies something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Richardson moved through the halls of Riverside Academy like morning fog present but barely noticed there one moment and forgotten the next. At 17, she had perfected the delicate art of existing without being seen, of occupying space without claiming it. Her petite frame of barely 5'3" seemed to shrink even smaller against the towering lockers and crowded corridors, while her shoulder-length chestnut hair fell in soft waves that she often tucked behind her ears when concentrating. The oversized navy cardigan she wore hung loosely over faded jeans, both carefully chosen from thrift stores to avoid drawing attention through either poverty or affluence. Her worn leather messenger bag, a gift from her grandmother years ago, contained the tools of her true passion: sketchbooks, charcoal pencils, and watercolors that had seen countless hours of use. The bag bore small stains and scuff marks that told stories of artistic adventures, though Emma would never share those stories aloud. Riverside Academy sprawled across 40 acres of manicured lawns and brick buildings in the heart of Millfield, Connecticut. The private school catered to the children of successful professionals, old money families, and ambitious parents who believed that the right educational pedigree could guarantee their offspring's future success. Emma didn't belong to any of these categories, attending only through a combination of academic scholarships and her mother's position as the school's head librarian, a job that came with tuition benefits but also marked Emma as different from her wealthier classmates. Social ecosystem of Riverside operated with mathematical precision. Popular students occupied the top tier, their confidence and connections creating an invisible but impenetrable barrier around their elevated status. Below them existed various subgroups defined by interests, achievements, or family connections: the athletes, the scholars, the artists, the rebels. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the truly invisible ones, students who had learned that survival meant avoiding notice entirely. Emma had found her place in this final category, but not by accident. Her invisibility was carefully cultivated, a conscious choice that allowed her to observe without being observed, to understand the social dynamics around her without becoming entangled in them. She had studied her classmates like a naturalist studying wildlife, learning their patterns and territories, understanding which spaces were safe and which were to be avoided. The art studio on the 3rd floor of the main building had become Emma's sanctuary during her 4 years at Riverside. While other students gathered in the cafeteria during lunch or socialized in the common areas between classes, Emma could be found at her corner easel, completely absorbed in whatever project demanded her attention. The studio smelled of paint and possibility, filled with the kind of natural light that made colors come alive on canvas. Mrs. Patterson, the art teacher, had grown accustomed to finding Emma there before the first period and long after the final bell, working with an intensity that seemed to consume her entire being. The elderly teacher recognized exceptional talent when she saw it, and Emma's work displayed a maturity and emotional depth that far exceeded her years. Her paintings told stories without words, captured feelings that most teenagers couldn't even identify, much less expressed through visual art. Emma's artistic style defied easy categorization. Her work combined realistic techniques with abstract elements, traditional media with unconventional materials, personal symbolism with universal themes. She painted landscapes that seemed to breathe with life, portraits that captured the essence of their subjects' souls, and abstract pieces that somehow made perfect sense despite their departure from recognizable forms. Her color choices were bold but harmonious, her compositions balanced yet dynamic. Most students at Riverside knew Emma existed in the same vague way they knew the school had a library or that classes ended at 3:15. She was part of the background, easily overlooked and rarely considered. In group projects, she was the reliable one who completed her portions without complaint or drama. In classes, she was the student who turned in exceptional work but never volunteered answers or drew attention to her achievements. Teachers appreciated Emma's consistency and talent, but few made efforts to draw her out of her shell. Her grades were excellent, her behavior exemplary, and her artwork was genuinely impressive. What more could they ask for? They failed to recognize that behind her quiet demeanor lay not shyness or insecurity, but a calculated decision to remain unnoticed, a survival strategy that had served her well but came at a significant personal cost. Emma's appearance was as carefully managed as her social invisibility. Her clothes were always clean and appropriate, but never fashionable or attention-grabbing. She wore minimal makeup, just enough to look put together without standing out. Her hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail when working, though. She occasionally wore it down during regular classes. The only hint of personal style came from a small silver pendant she always wore, a gift from her grandmother, that she never removed. The pendant was shaped like a lotus flower, its delicate petals catching light in subtle ways that most people never noticed. To casual observers, it was simply jewelry, but to Emma, it represented something far more significant. The lotus symbolizes rising from murky depths to bloom in sunlight, transformation through struggle, beauty emerging from unlikely circumstances. It reminded her daily that appearances could be deceiving. That strength often grew in hidden places. Emma's hands told a different story than her carefully neutral appearance suggested. Her fingers were long and elegant, stained with paint and charcoal despite her efforts to keep them clean. Small calluses marked her fingertips from hours of drawing and painting, while her palms bore the subtle toughness that came from working with various artistic materials. These hands moved with precision and confidence when creating art, displaying a grace and certainty that seemed at odds with her otherwise tentative presence. The current project consuming Emma's attention was her most ambitious undertaking, yet a mixed media installation that would serve as her senior capstone piece. She had been working on it for 8 months, combining traditional painting techniques with sculptural elements, incorporating found objects and personal artifacts to create something that transcended typical high school art projects. The piece explored themes of identity and transformation, drawing from her own experiences while speaking to universal struggles with self-discovery. The installation occupied a corner of the art studio, carefully organized across multiple surfaces and storage areas. Emma had documented every stage of the creative process in detailed journals, not because it was required, but because she understood the importance of artistic reflection and growth. This wasn't just a school assignment. It was her attempt to capture something essential about the human experience, to create art that would resonate with viewers long after they looked away. Working in relative solitude suited Emma perfectly. She had learned that explanation often diminished the power of visual art, that the most meaningful works spoke directly to viewers without requiring verbal interpretation. Her installation was designed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, offering different meanings to different observers while maintaining its essential coherence and emotional impact. As winter melted into spring and her senior year drew toward its conclusion, Emma found herself working with increasing intensity and focus. The annual senior art exhibition loomed ahead, representing not just academic assessment, but her introduction to the adult art world. College recruiters, scholarship committees, and local gallery owners would attend, making the exhibition a crucial opportunity for her future. What Emma didn't realize was that her carefully maintained invisibility was about to be shattered in ways she never could have anticipated. Her greatest artistic achievement was about to become the catalyst for a confrontation that would force her to choose between the safety of silence and the power that lay hidden beneath her quiet exterior. The storm that had been building within her for years was finally about to break. Emma's story began long before Riverside Academy, in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, where the sound of wooden practice swords cutting through air had been as common as the hum of the refrigerator. Her mother, Sarah Richardson, had built their life around quiet strength and careful planning after Emma's father disappeared when she was 7 years old. The man who had promised to love them forever had simply vanished one Tuesday morning, leaving behind only debt, disappointment, and 2 females who would learn to depend on each other completely. Sarah had transformed from a trusting wife into a fiercely protective single mother overnight. With a master's degree in library science and an unwavering determination to provide stability for her daughter, she had taken the position at Riverside Academy not just for the steady income, but for the educational opportunities it would afford Emma. The tuition benefit was worth more than Sarah's entire salary, representing a chance for Emma to access opportunities that would otherwise remain forever out of reach. The Richardson household operated on principles of self-reliance and quiet dignity. Sarah had learned that asking for help often came with strings attached, that charity frequently carried hidden costs, and that the safest path forward was the one you carved for yourself. These lessons had shaped Emma's worldview from an early age, teaching her that survival meant developing skills that others couldn't take away, building strength that didn't depend on external validation or support. Emma's introduction to martial arts had come through her grandmother, Margaret Chen Richardson, a woman whose own story bridged 2 cultures and multiple generations of struggle. Margaret had married Emma's grandfather after meeting him during his military service in Taiwan, immigrating to America in the 1960s when such marriages were still controversial, and Asian women faced discrimination that was both casual and systematic. She had carried with her not just the traditions of her homeland, but practical knowledge that would prove invaluable to her. American family. Margaret had studied traditional Chinese martial arts as a child in Taiwan, learning not the flashy tournament styles that Hollywood would later popularize, but the practical combat systems developed for real-world survival. Her training had emphasized stealth, efficiency, and the strategic use of an opponent's strength against them, skills that proved remarkably applicable to navigating life as an immigrant woman in mid-century America. She had adapted these principles to help her survive workplace discrimination, social exclusion, and the countless small battles that came with building a life in a country that didn't always welcome her presence. When Emma turned 8, the year after her father's abandonment, Margaret had quietly begun teaching her granddaughter the disciplines that had served her own survival. The lessons started with meditation and breathing exercises, practices that appeared innocent to outside observers, but formed the foundation of serious martial training. Emma learned to quiet her mind, to center her breathing, to find stillness, even in chaotic environments, skills that would later prove invaluable in the social combat zone of high school. The physical training had developed gradually over the years, hidden within what appeared to be simple exercise routines and grandmother-granddaughter bonding time. Margaret owned a small studio apartment above her flower shop in downtown Millfield, a space that had been quietly converted into a training facility that few people ever saw. The walls were lined with traditional weapons, practice mats covered. The floors and mirrors reflected movements that combined deadly precision with graceful beauty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma's training encompassed multiple disciplines, blending traditional kung fu with modern, tactical techniques that Margaret had learned through decades of adapting ancient knowledge to contemporary realities. She learned strikes and blocks, throws and escapes, but more importantly, she learned patience and timing. Margaret emphasized that the strongest fighters were often those who appeared weakest, that the most effective combat happened before opponents realized a fight had begun. The philosophical foundation of Emma's training was as important as the physical techniques. Margaret taught her that violence should always be a last resort, that true strength lay in avoiding conflicts rather than winning them, and that the greatest victory was often achieved without fighting at all. These lessons were reinforced through stories from Margaret's own life, tales of discrimination overcome through strategic thinking rather than direct confrontation, of battles won through patience and preparation rather than aggression. Emma's academic excellence at Riverside had its roots in this same disciplined approach to learning and self-improvement. The mental focus required for martial arts translated directly to scholarly pursuits, while the patience developed through years of repetitive training made her capable of sustained, intellectual effort that her classmates often found impossible to maintain. Her study habits reflected martial principles, consistent practice, attention to detail, and the understanding that mastery came through accumulation of small improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The art studio had become Emma's public training ground, a place where she could practice the same focused concentration and precise movement that characterized her martial arts without revealing the true nature of her abilities. Her painting technique demonstrated the same controlled breathing, steady hands, and unwavering attention that she brought to combat practice. The meditation skills Margaret had taught her allowed Emma to enter flow states while creating, losing herself completely in the artistic process while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. Emma's artistic vision had been shaped by her understanding of duality and hidden meanings, concepts central to her grandmother's teachings about survival and strategy. Her paintings often explored themes of concealed strength, apparent vulnerability masking inner power, and the beauty that could emerge from struggle and hardship. These weren't conscious choices so much as natural expressions of worldview that had been formed through years of living with carefully managed secrets. Financial pressures that shaped the Richardson household had taught Emma to value resources and opportunities that others might take for granted. Every art supply had been carefully budgeted, every canvas planned and used completely, every opportunity for learning seized with gratitude rather than entitlement. This appreciation for scarcity had made her more creative and resourceful than her wealthier classmates, forcing her to develop techniques and solutions that maximized impact while minimizing cost. Emma's relationship with her mother had evolved into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared understanding of their circumstances. Sarah worked long hours at the library, often staying late to provide the kind of dedicated service that justified her continued employment and Emma's continued enrollment. In return, Emma maintained perfect grades, avoided any behavior that might reflect poorly on her mother's position, and contributed to household stability through her own responsible choices and actions, the weight of representing her family's investment in her education had created a sense of responsibility that went far beyond typical teenage concerns. Emma understood that her success or failure would determine not just her own future, but her mother's sense of accomplishment and security. This pressure might have crushed a different personality, but Emma's training had taught her to transform pressure into focus, to use external expectations as motivation rather than allowing them to become paralyzing anxiety. Margaret's weekly visits to the Richardson household provided not just continued martial training, but emotional support and cultural grounding that helped Emma navigate the predominantly white, wealthy environment of Riverside Academy. These sessions reinforced the importance of maintaining her authentic self while adapting to circumstances, of honoring her heritage while embracing opportunities, of remaining true to her values while learning to succeed in systems that might not always welcome her presence. The lotus pendant Emma wore daily had been Margaret's gift on her 16th birthday, accompanied by teachings about the flower's significance in both Chinese and Buddhist traditions. The lotus grows in muddy water, Margaret had explained, but emerges clean and beautiful, transformed by its journey through darkness into something remarkable. This metaphor had become central to Emma's understanding of her own development, Her recognition that strength often grew in hidden places, that the most beautiful flowers sometimes bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances. What the students and faculty of Riverside Academy never suspected was that Emma Richardson possessed skills that would have impressed professional security consultants and law enforcement officers. Her training had evolved far beyond the traditional forms that most people associated with martial arts, incorporating modern tactical knowledge that transformed ancient techniques into contemporary survival tools. Margaret's teachings had adapted over the decades, incorporating elements from military combatives, law enforcement training, and modern self-defense systems that she had studied through books, videos, and occasional workshops with visiting instructors. Her flower shop in downtown Millfield served as more than a business. It was a hub for a quiet network of women who had learned that traditional authorities couldn't always protect them, that real safety came from developing personal capabilities that others couldn't take away. The network had grown organically over the years, connecting women who had survived domestic violence, workplace harassment, and various forms of predatory behavior. Margaret had become an unofficial teacher for this community, sharing techniques that emphasized practical effectiveness over traditional ceremony. Her students learned to defend themselves not in tournament settings with rules and referees, but in parking lots and stairwells and bedrooms, where the only rule was survival. Emma's training had included elements that most martial arts schools never addressed: escape techniques from confined spaces, methods for breaking free from multiple attackers, ways to use everyday objects as weapons, and most importantly, how to assess threats and avoid dangerous situations entirely. Margaret had taught her to read body language like a language, to recognize the subtle signs that preceded aggression, to understand how predators selected and approached their targets. The psychological aspects of Emma's education were perhaps more sophisticated than the physical techniques. Margaret had explained how intimidation worked, how bullies identified victims, how social hierarchies were established and maintained through displays of power. Emma learned that most conflicts were won or lost before the first blow was struck, that positioning and timing mattered more than raw strength, that the appearance of vulnerability could be strategically useful when backed by genuine capability. Emma's daily routine at Riverside included training exercises that were invisible to casual observers. Her morning walk to school incorporated balance and awareness drills. Her movements through hallways practiced evasion and positioning principles. And her time in the art studio included finger strengthening and fine motor control exercises that served dual purposes. She had learned to maintain her physical conditioning through activities that appeared completely normal to anyone watching. The meditation practices that formed the foundation of Emma's training had given her mental abilities that set her apart from her classmates in ways they couldn't understand. She could control her breathing and heart rate under stress, maintain clear thinking in chaotic environments, and observe situations with the kind of detached awareness that allowed her to notice details others missed. These skills had made her an exceptional student and artist, but they had been developed for far more serious purposes. Emma's understanding of anatomy and physiology exceeded what most pre-med students learned in their first year of college. Margaret had taught her about pressure points and nerve clusters, about how the human body responded to different types of impact, about the precise locations where minimal force could produce maximum effect. This knowledge was presented in the context of healing and protection rather than aggression. But Emma understood that the same information could be applied in multiple ways depending on circumstances. The weapons training that Margaret had provided focused on improvised and concealed options rather than traditional martial arts weapons that would be impractical in modern settings. Emma knew how to use pens and pencils as striking implements, how to transform her messenger bag into an effective defensive tool, how to use her belt or shoelaces for restraint or distraction purposes. More importantly, she had learned to think tactically about her environment, always noting potential weapons and escape routes, even in the safest situations. Emma's technological education had paralleled her physical training, with Margaret teaching her about personal security in the digital age. She understood how social media could be used to track and target victims, how to protect her online presence from predators, and how to document evidence of harassment or threats in ways that would be useful to authorities. These skills had made her more aware of her classmates' digital vulnerabilities, though she had never exploited this knowledge. The philosophy that governed Emma's use of her abilities was based on a strict code that Margaret had developed through her own experiences with discrimination and survival. Violence was always a last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted and genuine danger was imminent. Deception and misdirection were preferable to confrontation. Escape was better than engagement, and the goal was always to end conflicts as quickly and safely as possible rather than to punish or humiliate opponents. Emma's restraint was not weakness but discipline, the product of understanding exactly how much damage she could inflict and choosing not to use those capabilities except in the most extreme circumstances. Margaret had taught her that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared harmless, that true strength lay in choosing when not to fight rather than in winning battles that could have been avoided entirely. The art studio had become Emma's testing ground for integrating her physical and mental training with creative expression. Her paintings demonstrated the same controlled precision that characterized her martial arts, while her ability to work for hours in focused concentration reflected the mental discipline that Margaret had taught her. The hand-eye coordination required for detailed artwork had been enhanced by years of training that emphasized exact movement and perfect timing. Emma's academic performance was directly connected to her training philosophy. She approached each class with the same strategic thinking that governed her martial arts practice, analyzing teachers' expectations and assessment methods the way she had learned to analyze opponents' weaknesses and behavioral patterns. Her success came not from natural genius, but from the systematic application of principles that treated education as another form of competition, where preparation and persistence mattered more than raw talent. The social invisibility that Emma maintained at Riverside was itself a form of camouflage, a deliberate choice to avoid the kind of attention that might lead to conflicts she preferred to avoid. Margaret had taught her that the most effective fighters were often those who never had to fight. That strategic positioning could eliminate threats before they materialized, that sometimes the best defense was being overlooked entirely by potential aggressors. Emma's understanding of human psychology extended beyond personal protection to include insights about group dynamics, leadership structures, and the ways that social hierarchies were established and challenged. She could read the political undercurrents of her high school environment with the same analytical skills that she applied to potential physical threats, understanding who held real power versus who merely appeared powerful, who could be trusted, and who represented potential dangers. The most sophisticated aspect of Emma's training involved learning to control not just her own responses, but her opponent's perceptions and actions. Margaret had taught her how to use body language and vocal tones to project different impressions, how to appear more or less threatening depending on tactical requirements, how to manipulate conflicts in ways that minimize damage to all parties involved. These skills had served Emma well in navigating the complex social environment of Riverside Academy, allowing her to avoid becoming either victim or aggressor in the petty dramas that consumed many of her classmates. Victoria Sterling commanded the social landscape of Riverside Academy with the calculating precision of a chess grandmaster, her influence extending far beyond the typical reach of high school popularity. At 18, she possessed an intimidating combination of natural charisma, strategic intelligence, and the kind of cold ambition that made lesser students instinctively step aside when she approached. Standing 5'9" with platinum blonde Hairstyled to perfection and wearing designer outfits that cost more than most families spent on groceries, Victoria had never encountered a social situation she couldn't manipulate to her advantage. The Sterling family name carried significant weight throughout Connecticut's elite circles. Her father, Richard Sterling, owned a chain of luxury hotels that catered to politicians and celebrities, while her mother, Catherine, served on the boards of 3 different charitable foundations and had been featured twice in Connecticut magazine's most influential women lists. Victoria had grown up attending fundraising galas and political events, learning to read power dynamics and influence networks from the same age that other children were learning to tie their shoes. Victoria's approach to social dominance was sophisticated beyond her years, incorporating lessons learned from watching her parents navigate high-stakes business and political environments. She understood that direct confrontation was messy and often backfired, creating sympathy for targets and making her own behavior appear obviously malicious. Instead, she preferred campaigns of subtle psychological warfare, using her extensive network of followers and admirers to spread doubt and negativity, without leaving clear fingerprints of her involvement. Her methodology relied heavily on character assassination through whispered conversations and strategic social exclusion. Victoria had perfected the art of destroying reputations through carefully planted suggestions that gradually eroded credibility and social standing. She could make students question their own worth without ever directly insulting them, create social isolation that felt natural rather than orchestrated, and manipulate group dynamics in ways that made her targets feel like their exclusion was somehow their own fault. Victoria's inner circle consisted of carefully selected individuals whose skills complemented her own strategic vision and whose loyalty could be maintained through a combination of genuine friendship and calculated self-interest. She had learned from observing her parents' business practices that the most effective organizations combined shared goals with mutual benefit, creating relationships that were both personally meaningful and strategically valuable. Jason Mitchell had earned his place in Victoria's network through his exceptional athletic ability and his instinctive understanding of how physical intimidation could reinforce social hierarchies. At 6'2", with the broad shoulders and muscular build of a varsity lacrosse captain, Jason possessed the kind of imposing presence that made smaller students automatically defer to his wishes. His family's construction business had prospered by securing contracts with the same wealthy families whose children attended Riverside, creating financial connections that reinforced his social position. Jason's role in Victoria's operations went beyond simple muscle. Though his physical presence was certainly useful for creating the kind of subtle threat that made students think twice about challenging Victoria's decisions, he had developed sophisticated techniques for making people uncomfortable without crossing lines that would attract administrative attention. His mastery of strategic positioning in hallways, aggressive body language that stopped just short of actual menace, and perfectly timed interruptions of conversations had made him invaluable for situations where Victoria's psychological warfare needed physical reinforcement. The lacrosse team served as Jason's power base within the broader school social structure, providing him with a network of athletically gifted allies who understood the importance of loyalty and collective action. These relationships had been carefully cultivated over years of shared training, competition, and social events, creating bonds that extended far beyond sports into the realm of personal protection and mutual advancement. Jason's academic performance was adequate but unremarkable, maintained primarily through the extensive tutoring network that Victoria had helped him access through her family connections. His real education came from observing social dynamics and learning to read the subtle cues that indicated when situations were escalating toward confrontation. He had become expert at calibrating his interventions to produce maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. Brittany, Chun completed Victoria's inner circle through her exceptional abilities in digital manipulation and information warfare. Despite sharing a surname with Emma's grandmother, Brittany came from a completely different background. Her family had immigrated from Hong Kong in the 1990s with significant financial resources, establishing a successful import-export business that had made them wealthy enough to afford Riverside's tuition without scholarship assistance. Brittany's technical skills had developed through a combination of natural aptitude and expensive private instruction in computer programming and digital marketing. Her parents had recognized early that technological literacy would be crucial for success in the modern economy, investing heavily in their daughter's education in ways that went far beyond what most families could afford. By age 16, Brittany could manage complex social media campaigns, create and distribute digital content, and manipulate online information in ways that would have impressed professional marketing firms. Her role in Victoria's organization involved managing the digital aspects of their social campaigns, using carefully coordinated social media attacks to amplify offline psychological warfare. Brittany had mastered the art of creating fake accounts that appeared genuine, spreading rumors through networks that obscured their original sources, and documenting embarrassing moments that could be weaponized when strategic advantage required. Her understanding of platform algorithms and user psychology made her capable of making certain content go viral while burying other information that might threaten Victoria's interests. Brittany's family background had given her insights into the intersection of technology and social manipulation that proved invaluable for Victoria's purposes. Her parents' business success had required navigating complex international relationships and cultural differences, skills that translated directly to managing the multi-layered social environment of Riverside Academy. She had learned to present different faces to different audiences, to gather information without appearing curious, and to build trust with people whose friendship served strategic purposes. The three had formed an alliance that covered all the major avenues of high school social warfare. Victoria provided strategic intelligence and overall coordination. Jason offered physical intimidation and direct confrontation capabilities, while Brittany handled digital operations and information management. Together, they had successfully marginalized several students who had threatened Victoria's position, using combinations of social isolation, physical intimidation, and digital harassment that left their targets with few options for effective resistance. Victoria's decision to target Emma had emerged from her recognition that the quiet art student represented a growing threat to her own carefully maintained position as Riverside's most promising senior. The attention that Emma's artwork was beginning to attract from faculty members and outside observers posed a direct challenge to Victoria's assumption that she would dominate the senior class's achievements and recognition. More troubling was the way certain teachers had begun speaking about Emma's work with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that Victoria had worked years to cultivate for her own accomplishments. The timing of their campaign against Emma had been calculated to coincide with the most stressful period of the senior art exhibition preparation, when Emma's emotional resources would be stretched thin and her ability to respond effectively would be most compromised. Victoria understood that artists were particularly vulnerable to attacks on their creative work, that questioning Emma's talent and authenticity would undermine her confidence in ways that direct personal attacks might not achieve. Their strategy represented the culmination of everything the three had learned about psychological warfare, social manipulation, and systematic harassment. They had no way of knowing that they had chosen to target someone whose capabilities extended far beyond anything they had encountered in their previous campaigns, someone whose restraint was a choice rather than a limitation, and someone whose family had spent years preparing her for exactly the kind of confrontation they were about to initiate. The senior art exhibition at Riverside Academy represented far more than academic assessment. It was Emma's gateway to a future that had seemed impossible just months earlier. College scouts from prestigious art programs would attend. Scholarship committees would review portfolios, and local gallery owners had expressed genuine interest in purchasing student work for their collections. For the first time in her life, Emma's careful invisibility was working against her as opportunities demanded visibility and recognition. Mrs. Patterson had spent weeks convincing Emma to submit her installation to the main exhibition space rather than the smaller, less prominent display area traditionally reserved for students who preferred minimal attention. The art teacher recognized that Emma's mixed media piece demonstrated sophistication that deserved the primary showcase. But more importantly, she understood that certain opportunities required strategic visibility that went against Emma's every instinct for self-preservation. The process of preparing for public display had stripped away every protective layer that Emma had built around her creative work over the years. Her installation required detailed explanatory materials that forced her to articulate concepts she had never needed to express in words. Artist statements, technical specifications, and conceptual frameworks all demanded a level of personal revelation that felt like emotional surgery performed in public view. Emma's installation occupied the central corridor of the main gallery, positioned where it would be impossible for visitors to miss or ignore. The piece consisted of 7 interconnected panels that told the story of transformation through adversity, incorporating traditional painting techniques with sculptural elements, family photographs, and interactive digital components that revealed different layers of meaning depending on how viewers approached them. The work was deeply personal, drawing from her own experiences with invisibility and hidden strength, while speaking to universal themes of resilience and self-discovery. The technical complexity of the installation had required collaboration with the school's maintenance staff, coordination with other exhibiting students, and approval from administrators who were unaccustomed to artwork that incorporated electronic elements and unconventional materials. Each interaction had forced Emma further from her comfort zone, requiring negotiations and compromises that felt like exposing vital organs to surgical examination. The scholarship implications of the exhibition had created pressure that went far beyond artistic recognition. Emma's family's financial situation made college funding a critical concern, and several of the most promising scholarship opportunities required submission of work that had been displayed in juried exhibitions. Her participation in the senior show had transformed from optional achievement to mandatory requirement, eliminating any possibility of retreat or alternative approaches. The installation process itself had become a form of public performance that contradicted everything Emma had learned about staying safe through invisibility. Students and faculty members regularly stopped by to observe her progress, offering unsolicited advice and commentary that felt like criticism disguised as encouragement. The privacy she had always maintained around her creative process was completely eliminated, leaving her feeling exposed and defensive during the most crucial phase of her artistic development. Emma's emotional investment in the project had grown beyond reasonable proportions, partly because of the external pressure, but also because the work represented her most honest attempt to capture something essential about her own experience. Every brushstroke carried personal significance. Every compositional choice reflected internal struggles that she had never shared with anyone except through visual metaphor. The installation had become not just art, but autobiography. Not just expression, but exposure. The weeks leading up to the exhibition opening had been marked by a series of small incidents that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively created an atmosphere of mounting tension and unease. Emma's usual parking spot near the art building had been consistently occupied by vehicles that hadn't previously used that area. Her locker had been tampered with multiple times, never quite enough to prove intentional interference, but sufficient to make her constantly check and recheck her belongings. More troubling were the social dynamics that had begun shifting around Her increased visibility. Students who had never acknowledged her existence were suddenly offering opinions about her work. Teachers who had barely noticed her were expressing unexpected interest in her college plans, and administrators were including her in conversations about representing the school at regional competitions. The attention felt simultaneously validating and threatening, recognition that came with expectations and responsibilities she had never sought. Emma's daily routines had been disrupted by the demands of exhibition preparation, forcing her to spend more time in public spaces and social situations that challenged her carefully developed strategies for remaining unnoticed. Installation planning meetings, technical rehearsals, and promotional events all required her to engage with people and circumstances that felt alien and uncomfortable after years of deliberate isolation. The digital components of her installation had necessitated learning new technical skills that pushed her beyond her comfort zone in multiple directions simultaneously. She had incorporated QR codes that linked to audio recordings of her grandmother's stories, embedded sensors that triggered different lighting effects based on viewer proximity, and created interactive elements that revealed hidden layers of meaning through touch and movement. The technology served her artistic vision, but also created multiple points of potential failure that could sabotage months of work in an instant. Emma's relationship with her mother had become strained under the pressure of new expectations and opportunities that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. Sarah Richardson found herself navigating conversations with college recruiters and scholarship administrators that required knowledge and confidence she didn't possess. While Emma struggled with guilt about the additional burdens her success was placing on her family's already limited resources, the physical demands of installation preparation had begun affecting Emma's training routine with Margaret, forcing her to choose between maintaining her martial arts practice and meeting her artistic deadlines. The reduced training time had left her feeling mentally and physically off balance, less centered and more reactive than she had been in years. The discipline that normally governed her responses to stress and conflict had been compromised by exhaustion and competing priorities. Margaret had noticed the changes in her granddaughter's demeanor and had attempted to provide additional support and guidance, but the circumstances of Emma's situation had created challenges that traditional martial arts philosophy seemed inadequate to address. The exhibition represented an opportunity that could transform Emma's future, but it also exposed her to risks and vulnerabilities that went against every survival strategy she had been taught. The social ecosystem of Riverside Academy had begun responding to Emma's increased prominence in ways that felt both subtle and menacing. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Groups of students watched her with expressions that seemed to combine curiosity with calculation, and the hallway dynamics that had previously allowed her to move invisibly had shifted into patterns that felt like observation and assessment. Emma's installation had attracted attention from sources beyond the school community, including local media outlets that had begun covering the annual exhibition as a cultural event worthy of public interest. The prospect of newspaper coverage and television interviews had created additional layers of pressure and visibility that threatened to completely shatter the protective anonymity she had spent years cultivating. The week before the exhibition opening, Emma realized that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no easy return. Her decision to participate had committed her to a level of exposure and vulnerability that conflicted with every instinct she had developed about staying safe through invisibility. She had placed her most meaningful work in a position where it could be judged, criticized, or even attacked by anyone who chose to attend the exhibition, creating a perfect storm of artistic, personal, and professional risk that left her feeling more exposed than she had ever been in her life. The attack came on a Thursday evening, 3 days before the exhibition opening, when the art building was supposed to be empty except for the skeleton crew of maintenance workers who cleaned the classrooms after hours. Emma had stayed late to make final adjustments to her installation's lighting system, fine-tuning the sensors and digital components that would bring her piece to life for viewers. She had received permission from building security to work past normal hours, a privilege granted only to students whose projects required technical setup that couldn't be completed during regular class periods. Victoria's intelligence network had provided detailed information about Emma's schedule, including her habit of working alone in the art studio during evening hours when faculty supervision was minimal. The timing of their operation had been calculated to occur when Emma would be most isolated and vulnerable, when the destruction of her work would have maximum psychological impact and minimal chance of interruption or intervention. Jason had used his connections with the athletic department to obtain access to the building through service entrances that were monitored less carefully than main doors. His familiarity with the school's layout and security procedures, gained through years of late-night team meetings and equipment storage responsibilities, allowed him to move through the building without triggering alarms or attracting attention from the security guards who patrolled the main corridors. Brittany had disabled the security cameras, covering the art wing through a sophisticated hack that replaced their live feeds with looped recordings from earlier in the week, creating the illusion of normal empty hallways while concealing the actual activities taking place in the galleries. Her access to the school's network infrastructure, obtained through a combination of social engineering and technical exploitation, had given her the ability to manipulate digital evidence in ways that would make investigation difficult and prosecution nearly impossible. Emma was adjusting the final sensor when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the art studio, a movement that was too purposeful and coordinated to belong to maintenance workers going about their routine duties. Her training kicked in immediately, heightening her awareness and triggering the threat assessment protocols that Margaret had drilled into her consciousness through years of practice. She recognized that she was in a confined space with limited escape routes, facing an unknown number of potential adversaries who had deliberately chosen this time and location for reasons that were unlikely to be benign. The studio's layout offered few defensive advantages, with multiple entry points but only one practical exit that could be easily blocked by determined opponents. Emma's position near her installation placed her in the center of the room, exposed to attack from multiple directions, but also within reach of potential improvised weapons and defensive tools. Her messenger bag contained art supplies that could be repurposed for self-defense, while the studio itself offered numerous objects that could be used tactically if circumstances required physical confrontation. Victoria entered first, her confidence and bearing making it clear that she was leading whatever operation was about to unfold. Her designer clothes and perfectly styled appearance created a surreal contrast with the obvious malice in her expression, like watching a magazine model preparing to commit vandalism. She moved with the kind of casual authority that came from never having been seriously challenged, never having encountered resistance that couldn't be overcome through social pressure or family influence. Jason followed close behind, his athletic build and aggressive posture designed to create immediate intimidation and psychological pressure. His positioning near the studio's main exit was clearly strategic, cutting off Emma's most obvious escape route while maintaining the ability to escalate to physical confrontation if psychological warfare proved insufficient. His expression combined cruelty with excitement, the look of someone who genuinely enjoyed inflicting suffering on others and rarely faced consequences for his actions. Brittany brought up the rear, carrying a high-end camera and multiple smartphones that would document whatever was about to occur for later distribution through social media and digital platforms. Her role as chronicler and propagandist was crucial to their strategy, ensuring that Emma's humiliation would be preserved and amplified long after the immediate confrontation ended. The technical quality of her equipment suggested that this was a planned operation rather than spontaneous cruelty. Victoria's opening words were carefully chosen to maximize psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about her true intentions. She complimented Emma's installation with the kind of exaggerated praise that was obviously sarcastic, describing the work's cultural elements in terms that were technically respectful but delivered with enough mockery to make their true meaning unmistakable. Her voice carried the practiced cruelty of someone who had perfected the art of insult disguised as compliment. The verbal assault escalated systematically, with Victoria questioning not just Emma's artistic ability, but her right to represent the school at prestigious events, her family's legitimacy as members of the Riverside community, and her personal worth as both student and human being. Each attack was designed to undermine a different aspect of Emma's identity and self-confidence, creating cumulative damage that would be difficult to recover from regardless of whether physical destruction followed. Jason's contributions to the psychological warfare were more direct but equally calculated, focusing on Emma's physical vulnerability and social isolation. He reminded her that she had no friends to protect her, no family connections to provide consequences for her mistreatment, and no realistic options for resistance against opponents who possessed every advantage that mattered in their shared environment. His proximity and size were used to reinforce these verbal threats with implicit physical menace. Emma's response to this confrontation was initially the same restraint and strategic patience that had characterized her approach to conflict throughout her time at Riverside Academy. She remained silent, avoiding eye contact that might be interpreted as challenge or aggression, positioning herself to minimize vulnerability while avoiding movements that might trigger escalation to physical violence. Her breathing remained controlled, her heart rate steady, her mind clear despite the stress of the situation. The transformation began when Victoria produced a container of black paint and announced her intention to improve Emma's installation by adding elements that would better reflect its true quality and cultural significance. The sight of paint being open near her artwork triggered a response in Emma that bypassed rational thought and accessed something far more primitive and protective. This was no longer about social dynamics or personal humiliation. This was an attack on the thing that mattered most to her in the world. Emma's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a quality that none of her tormentors had ever heard before. The words themselves were simple, a request that they leave her work alone, but the tone suggested depths of capability and determination that contradicted everything they thought they knew about her character. For the first time in the confrontation, Victoria hesitated, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of their interaction. Brittany, focused on recording the scene through her devices, missed the subtle changes in Emma's posture and positioning that someone with martial arts training might have recognized as preparation for action. Jason, confident in his physical advantages and accustomed to intimidating smaller opponents through presence alone, failed to notice that Emma's apparent cowering was actually strategic positioning that optimized her defensive options while concealing her true capabilities. The moment of decision came when Victoria raised the paint container above Emma's installation, her motions slow and theatrical, to maximize the psychological impact of the impending destruction. In that instant, Emma's years of training, her grandmother's teachings about protection and justice, and her own deep love for her art converged into crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. The quiet girl who had spent 4 years avoiding conflict was about to become someone entirely different, someone her tormentors had never imagined could exist. What happened next unfolded with the fluid precision of water flowing downhill, inevitable and unstoppable once the first movement began. Emma's transformation from passive victim to active defender occurred in the space between one heartbeat and the next, so smoothly that her opponents didn't immediately understand that the fundamental nature of their encounter had changed completely. The paint container never reached Emma's artwork. As Victoria's hand began its downward arc, Emma moved with speed and efficiency that seemed to defy physics, her small frame suddenly occupying space that had been empty a microsecond earlier. Her fingers found the pressure point on Victoria's wrist with surgical precision, applying exactly enough force to cause involuntary muscle relaxation without permanent damage. The container dropped harmlessly to the floor, its contents spilling across concrete rather than canvas. Victoria's gasp of pain and surprise was the first sound any of them had made since Emma's quiet request for them to leave her work alone. The perfectly manicured hand that had wielded social weapons with such devastating effect throughout high school was suddenly useless. Fingers numb and unresponsive from nerve compression that would fade in minutes but felt like permanent disability. In the moment, for the first time in her privileged life, Victoria Sterling found herself completely powerless. Jason's athletic reflexes kicked in as he processed what had just occurred, his brain struggling to reconcile the impossible image of tiny Emma Richardson, subduing his partner with movements that belonged in martial arts movies rather than high school confrontations. His response was predictably direct, a charging rush designed to use his size and strength advantages to overwhelm an opponent who couldn't possibly pose a real threat to someone with his physical capabilities. Emma's counter was textbook perfect, a technique that Margaret had made her practice thousands of times until it became as natural as breathing. She used Jason's momentum against him, redirecting his forward energy into a trajectory that sent him stumbling past her position, while simultaneously striking the nerve cluster in his thigh that temporarily disrupted his balance and coordination. The larger boy crashed into an empty easel, his confusion evident as he tried to understand how someone half his size had made him look clumsy and ineffective. Brittany, still focused on recording the encounter through her phone, captured everything with the detached fascination of someone watching a nature documentary about predators and prey. Her camera documented Jason's failed charge, Victoria's obvious pain, and Emma's impossible grace under pressure, creating evidence that would later serve purposes none of them could anticipate in the moment. Emma's voice, when she spoke again, carried the calm authority of someone who had taken complete control of a situation that moments earlier had seemed hopeless. She suggested that her uninvited visitors leave immediately, before circumstances escalated beyond their ability to understand or control. Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, but something in her eyes made it clear that this was not a request subject to negotiation or debate. Victoria, cradling her still numb hand, attempted to reassert her social dominance through verbal threats about consequences and retaliation, promises about what would happen when her family learned about Emma's unprovoked attack on innocent students who had simply come to admire her artwork. Her words carried less conviction than usual, undermined by the growing realization that she was operating in territory where her traditional advantages no longer applied. Emma's response demonstrated an understanding of power dynamics that her tormentors had never suspected she possessed. She acknowledged Victoria's family connections and social influence while pointing out that those advantages required believable narratives to be effective, that accusations needed credible evidence to carry weight with authority figures who had their own reputations to protect. The implications of Emma's words became clear as Brittany reviewed the footage she had captured, realizing that her camera had documented not the victim and perpetrators, but 3 students attacking someone who had defended herself with remarkable restraint and precision. The video showed Victoria attempting to vandalize Emma's artwork, Jason charging at a much smaller opponent, and Emma responding with minimal force that neutralized threats without causing serious injury. Jason, still struggling with the muscle coordination issues caused by Emma's nerve strike, attempted one more aggressive move that ended even more embarrassingly than his first effort. Emma's defensive response involved a leverage technique that sent him to the floor despite his size advantage, demonstrating clearly that their physical confrontation was as one-sided as their social warfare had previously been. His athletic reputation would never recover from being repeatedly defeated by someone who appeared to be the weakest possible opponent. The psychological transformation of the 3 aggressors was as dramatic as Emma's physical revelation. Victoria's carefully constructed sense of invulnerability crumbled as she realized that some forms of power couldn't be purchased or inherited, that certain people possessed capabilities that existed outside the social systems she had always used to maintain control. Her worldview, built around the assumption that money and connections could solve any problem, proved inadequate for circumstances that required personal strength and competence. Jason's identity as a physically intimidating athlete was shattered by his complete inability to threaten someone who understood how bodies worked in ways that had nothing to do with muscle mass or training intensity. His size, which had always been his primary source of confidence and social value, became a liability against an opponent who could turn physical advantages into vulnerabilities with techniques he couldn't comprehend or counter. Brittany's technological expertise, which had made her valuable to Victoria's operations, suddenly seemed childish and amateur compared to Emma's demonstration of real-world capabilities that didn't depend on digital tools or social media manipulation. Her cameras had captured her own ally's humiliation, creating evidence that would undermine rather than support their intended narrative about the evening's events. Emma's final words to her defeated opponents contained both warning and wisdom, delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to confused children. She noted that their attack had failed not just tactically but strategically, that their evidence would support her version of events rather than theirs, and that any future harassment would be met with responses calibrated to match the level of threat they chose to present. The three left the art studio in very different conditions than they had entered, their confidence replaced by confusion, their assumptions about power and vulnerability fundamentally challenged by an encounter that had revealed the limits of their traditional advantages. Victoria's hand would regain full function within hours. Jason's coordination would return to normal by morning, and Brittany's footage would eventually be deleted. But the psychological impact of their defeat would influence their behavior for the remainder of their time at Riverside Academy. Emma returned to her installation work as if nothing unusual had occurred, making final adjustments to lighting and positioning with the same focused concentration she had brought to the project. For months, her hands remained steady, her breathing calm, her expression peaceful as she prepared her artwork for public viewing. The confrontation that might have destroyed another student's confidence had only reinforced her certainty that some things were worth protecting regardless of personal cost. The senior art exhibition opened 3 days later to unprecedented attendance and enthusiasm, with Emma's installation receiving recognition that exceeded even Mrs. Patterson's optimistic expectations. College scouts offered scholarship opportunities, gallery owners expressed serious interest in her future work, and local media coverage highlighted the sophistication and emotional power of her artistic vision. Victoria, Jason, and Brittany attended the exhibition opening with their families, maintaining public appearances while privately processing the reality that their social dominance had encountered something they couldn't understand, defeat, or control. They had learned that quiet people sometimes carried the loudest storms, that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving, and that true strength often grew in hidden places, revealed only when circumstances demanded that silence transform into action. Emma's grandmother attended the exhibition as well, observing her granddaughter's success with pride that encompassed both artistic achievement and personal growth. Margaret understood that Emma had crossed a threshold that night in the art studio, moving from student to practitioner, from protected to protector, from someone who carried knowledge to someone who could apply it when justice demanded action over restraint. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.